Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show, bringing you our episode with Dr. Gerald Horne. This, of course, is the podcast version of the live episode. If you prefer to see us talking, you can always go to the YouTube channel and check that out. Dr. Horne is, well, gosh, he's a historian and a half. He's written over 40 books on histories, usually from the people's point of view or dealing with racial issues, but also music, sports, just in general. He looks at all of the aspects of history that you don't quite often see. And with this time of social justice and trying to understand different racial groups, I thought he would be a fantastic guest to bring on. His latest book, it's a long title here. It's called The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. Now, look, when you get into these kind of topics, you start asking questions and you have an open mind, you find out that these things are a lot more complex than what you're often seeing in the news or whatever. You know, I'm openly critical of the 1619 Project because this stuff is important. It's important to get it right. And when you understand how many different countries were in some way creating the slave trade, you start to understand this is not just one group of people. It's nations of people who all promoted this. And then we all slowly got to the point where slavery took on different forms and ultimately was outlawed and now happens in other ways. Either way, get off my soapbox here. Gerald Horne is a powerful voice in all of this. And as we try to sort all these things together and we gather these different perspectives, his is an important one. So I think it's fun. The last several shows we've had on Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Dr. Will Riley, Dr. Ed Larson, and now we have Gerald Horne. It's a lot of historians and political science folks talking about problems at a big level. And if you're following, you know, we're not taking one side or the other. We're representing all of these sides. And I love that we got a chance to do this. Okay, so a couple other notes. I'm going to be doing some camping, so I may be slow in getting some shows out the next couple of days. Depends on my level of Wi-Fi access. But the main thing is the Prison Chronicles are set to start to release on the 24th. I'll get caught up on the shows that I haven't put up if I'm camping and it takes a little longer. Got some family issues I'm dealing with. So hang in there with me. They'll keep coming out and we're got plenty more to come. So no worries there. Just using some of this summertime to get caught up on things, get the Prison Chronicles out, and also take care of some very, very important family stuff. All right, here comes Dr. Gerald Horne.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner. Hey, man, how are you?
Hey, it's all good. What about you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Thanks for coming on the show. I was just kind of doing a freestyle on your book that just came out, and I was sort of I was doing your job trying to explain what it is. But let me shut up, man, and let you tell us about this book. One of the things that I'm always interested in is understanding. You know, if I'm going to be critical of like the 1619 Project, what about all the other folks that were here in the North American continent area prior to those dates? Because slavery was common and there was all kinds of folks here. So talk a little bit about your book. I'm going to put a link in here for it for everybody if you guys want to get it, and then we'll just take it from there. And thanks so much, Gerald, for coming on.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And so this book, as you suggested in your introduction, deals with what I call the long 16th century, from Columbus's voyage in 1492 to the English crossing the Atlantic in 1607 and settling in the territory that is now known as Virginia. A major thesis of this book is how was it that England, which was a minor monarchy on the fringes of Europe, was able to surge ahead and challenge Spain, which had the first mover's advantage. Not only did they sponsor Christopher Columbus, but decades before the arrival of the English in what they call Virginia, Spain had established a settlement in today's St. Augustine, Florida, which is still with us to this very day.
And the first Thanksgiving by some people's account.
Yeah, that's where I did a lot of my research, in fact, is in St. Augustine, Florida, which has a very significant archive at the St. Augustine Historical Society. And this is a topic, that is to say, how did England surge ahead, that I dealt with in my preceding book, which deals with the long 17th century.
Right.
That is to say, from 1607, or actually, I should say the short 17th century, from 1607 to the so-called Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. With regard to the book at hand, the short answer is that there was a religious conflict between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. The Protestants were the scrappy underdog. The Catholics were, in a sense, the superpower, challenged, to be sure, by the Ottoman Turks, who were Muslim. And in fact, one can say that this entire historical epic that reaches a kind of zenith in 1492 was actually kicked off in 1453 when the Muslims ousted Christians from what is now Istanbul into Turkey. Well, this religious conflict caused the underdog English to make many compromises. For example, they expelled their Jewish community in 1291. Spain had done the same in 1492. And yet it was Protestant England, and also I should say Protestant Dutch, who were much more coming to the Jewish community. The Spanish had a religious quality to be accepted. When Moses and Stephen L. Austin moved into what was then northern Mexico, what becomes the U.S. state we call Texas, in the first few decades of the 19th century, they had to at least profess Catholicism. The English did not say you had to be a Protestant in order to join their settlements. They outflanked and outwitted the Spanish by moving from religion, that is to say, from moving from religion as a qualifier to which morphs into whiteness, which morphs into white supremacy. And so therefore, those who they were warring with on the shores of Europe, the Irish Catholics, for example, the Scottish Catholics, for example, the Welsh to a certain degree, and I already mentioned the Jewish, suddenly when they crossed the Atlantic in a rebranding exercise that would make Madison Avenue blush, they're rebranded as white. And of course, that kind of militarized identity politics, as I call it, allows them to unite against the indigenous population. And also it facilitates their enslavement of the Africans, who of course were not defined as white. And therein you begin to see this historical process that eventuated on May 25th with the lynching on tape of George Floyd on the Minneapolis, an era in which we're still enmeshed.
I thought we might also take a moment to academically identify what is white, because Spaniards, by some definition, are white, Egyptians, Greeks. What is white in terms of our conversation?
Well, let's deal with it in terms of the United States. You've had Supreme Court decisions on this. In the 1920s, for example, when you had this anti-immigrant hysteria, you had South Asians who said that their roots were, quote, Aryan, unquote, but the Supreme Court said, no, you're not white. You had Japanese who were trying to say the same thing. The Supreme Court said no. It's really sort of an arbitrary definition. I would say its roots from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. But, Lebanese Christians have been defined as white. Look at Ralph Nader, for example. Right. Look at the comedian Danny Thomas. Now, Of course, Lebanese Muslims are another story, which really reflects the religious roots of this arbitrary racial construction. You've had Iranian Jewish, particularly in Los Angeles, they seem to be defined as white. Iranian Muslims, I'm not really sure. It's sort of at least on the margins, it's a hazy concept. But of course, not on the margins, and the 95% plus of those who are defined as, quote, white, unquote, it's rather clear.
Yeah, and just to continue to make the point, I've had a guy, and yet what place is more complex than Turkey? I've had a guy who was darker complected than you look at me and say, I'm white. And like, how do you deal with that? You just have to accept that there's going to be some uncertainty about it. Like the Supreme Court has also ruled that tomatoes are fruit in terms of trade, all kinds of crazy things that we have to deal with when it comes to what is whiteness. But I think your last point is the fair one. Like, if you are not white, you know it and you feel it right away. So when we look at the condition of white people, then, so in terms of America, we're excluding Spaniards and Italians from this era. What was the role? Gosh, it's so confusing with the white thing too, because Semites in general, right? Like you get into the point where the religion divides people into whiteness or not. That's also confusing. What was the role of Islamic folks in the long 16th century? Do they have a significant role in North America in terms of the slave trade or any kind of business?
Well, keep in mind that the Ottoman Turks were a major power.
Right.
And one of the reasons why some still use the term perfidious Albion, referring to England, is because the Protestant English, even though they were Christian, they collaborated with the Muslims vis-a-vis the Catholic Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly enough, a turning point in world history comes in 1591 when London collaborates with Muslims, and I should also say non-Muslims as well, in Morocco, North Africa, to destabilize the Songhai Empire due south in Africa, which then helps to facilitate the onrushing African slave trade, since you have negative knock-on effects resonating as far south as today's Nigeria, which helps to explain why a person like myself is now here in North America speaking English.
Right.
But in any case, the Muslims were a major political force and really helped to induce terror and fear and loathing in Christian Europeans, which is one of the reasons why London's entente with the Turks was seen as so bothersome. In fact, in the book, in passing, I make an analogy between the entente the United States develops with China in the early 1970s in order to confront the then Soviet Union, which in my estimation was a turning point in terms of how we got to where we are today. And this not only caused outrage amongst certain forces, conservative forces in the United States in the early 1970s, it also caused outrage amongst those in the so-called socialist world as well. And the analogy that I draw is to what England did in the 1500s.
Can we do a little bit more background too on this? Because we know so little about North America prior to the revolution. What are your thoughts on the presence of Africans here in the North American continent? I mean, every other people we're finding out sailed across the oceans way earlier than we're giving them credit for. There's Asian DNA in the Brazilian basin. It has to be true that Africans were sailing. I mean, it's the closest sail, right? So what are your thoughts on the prevalence of Africans in the North American continent or South American continent as well?
Well, certainly there were ocean currents that served as escalators that could drive Africans who were so inclined across the Atlantic to what we call the Americas. This was the thesis of the late anthropologist and historian Ivan van Sertima in his book, They Came Before Columbus.
Right.
Likewise, as I talk about in the book, even though, and it's not something I quarrel with necessarily, there's been a lot of focus on 1619 and 2019 as a 400-year odyssey. And I haven't quarreled with that concept because I thought it opened a conversation, which is still going on.
Yeah.
With regard to enslavement and the fruits of enslavement. However, the Spanish from their perch in Santo Domingo in today's Dominican Republic, as early as the 1520s, had brought enslaved Africans to what is now South Carolina. And of course, they defected to the Native American side, and the Spanish were chased back to Hispaniola, which was a factor opening the door about a century later to the arrival of Londoners in what they call Virginia in 1607.
So when we look at all of these players that are present in North America, Africans, Spaniards, I mean, just, Portuguese, I mean, they're all over the place as well, too. Yeah, why is it that, especially with the Spaniards, with their massive footprint, how is it that this turns in a historically short period to go from being dominated by the Spaniards and the French who have all this space? How does it go that this small group of colonies band together? I mean, what did they figure out? What luck came into play? How did this, Because it's like the last time in history, at least in terms of the history of this globe, that there's this open landmass that is available for all of these established world powers to come in and vie over. And then there's these Brits at the end that have figured it out.
Well, obviously, there's a certain amount of ruthlessness involved in these European settlers and colonizers. It's not like the Native Americans gave up their land willingly. I mean, they were basically ousted forcibly. And then, of course, as many historians like to stress, there are various pandemics introduced by microbes. The pandemic, for example, that we're now experiencing today, you can imagine, well, how it might have been experienced 400 to 500 years ago, given 130,000 people have died in the United States in a matter of months. And then one of the points that I make in the book, and to an extent, I draw on secondary literature, that is to say, the work of other scholars. Mm-hmm. The warfare, the bloody warfare that coursed through the British Isles, particularly the English versus the Irish. These were like warm-up games, if you like, for what then transpired in North America and the Caribbean, because they had to perfect weaponry, they had to perfect military formations and military discipline. So the English, particularly, they practiced on the Irish, which makes it even more ironic that then the Irish become some of the major settlers after they're sort of overrun by the English. It's one of the ironies of history.
Yeah, and I suppose that the Irish are like, we know how to beat people up because we just got beat up ourselves when we took off Why did the Africans, and we're not saying all, but why did the Africans go towards the Native American side? Was there some kind of was there a klaxon that called them? Or can you make heads or tails of it?
Well, as you know, there's this old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah,
I mean that's still a staple of international affairs and international relations as we speak. And I think that staple of international affairs was also operative hundreds of years ago, insofar as the Europeans wanted the land of the indigenous and they wanted the free labor of the Africans, which in a sense drove the Africans and the indigenous into each other's arms, so that they could unite against the Europeans. Having said that, it should not be ignored, as I'm sure some of our conservative fellow citizens will point out, that you had Africans who allied with the Europeans historically. I mean, even during the U.S. Civil War, although it's unclear whether or not any Africans were actually rifle-toting soldiers in the so-called Confederate States of America, it is beyond dispute that they were part of Confederate forces. And in fact, I was just reading today, I'm doing another project on Texas. And so I've been reading a lot about Oklahoma, Texas' northern neighbor. And there is a wonderful assortment of oral history on the website of the University of Oklahoma. You can find it under Indian Pioneer Papers. And as you know, the Native Americans who were forced to move to Oklahoma, many of them were called civilized because they owned Africans, particularly the Cherokee. The last Confederate general to surrender was a Cherokee, Stand, S-T-A-N-D, Watie, W-A-T-I-E. In some of the oral histories that I was reading just today, in fact, you had folks who would be defined as Black, although they were of partial Native American ancestry. And why they would be defined as Black is another story, although I can get into it.
Right.
And they were fighting alongside Stan Watie in June 1865, after Juneteenth, when supposedly slavery had ended.
Right.
So this is a very complex story we're talking about.
All this stuff is complex, man. Like it's crazy when you think about even, we've redefined what Columbus was, but we don't care about Verrazano or Balboa or Amerigo Vespucci. And then if it wasn't Columbus, would anybody from that era have acted differently? I mean, if you and I showed up on a ship full of 100 dudes and we get to a civilization, we could try to be nice or we could try to be dominant and try to own those guys. It just seems, and if you come with guns and they've got, human sacrifice going on, I just, not that it's not abhorrent, but I just also believe that almost anybody who showed up was going to act in a way that was similar, because if you don't, history forgets you because you're dead.
Well, I don't know. I'm very sensitive to Native American concerns. I mean, the
sure.
loss that they've suffered is mind-boggling. I mean, it's difficult to think of any other people. I mean, even if you look at Africa, I mean, certainly the African slave trade led to the deaths of millions of Africans, but the African continent is still there, largely populated by Africans, although, as we know, the political economy is another story. Whereas the Native Americans were generally liquidated, and this land was then taken over by another people. And that kind of loss is just bewildering. And in any case, it seems to me that if we do not do a critique of that process, we open the door. That is to say, if we say, well, that's history, some people lose, some people win. If you rationalize that, then that opens the door to, say, China in the latter part of the 21st century saying, you know what? I think we should sail across the Pacific and seize all the software engineers from Seattle to San Diego and then drag them back across the Pacific to work for us for free. And actually, while we're at it, maybe we should seize the territory too. But now I think that history has advanced and culture has advanced, where I think many people would see that as being not the proper thing to do, shall we say.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the reaction retrospectively to the Columbus enterprise.
Yeah, in 2072, Way sailed across the ocean blue. Jokes about mass murder, hilarious. Okay, I want to get more into the ideas that we're talking about here. So, what are the other problems that we're trying to figure out with all of this stuff? Is this sets the table for the English primarily to then dominate the North American continent. But when we talk about colonizers, we are really talking about a lot more people than just, because as St. Augustine is a colony. There's all kinds of colonies that happen. As a historian, when you look at colonizing, is it a bad thing? Is it a human thing? I mean, there's all kinds of colonies that have happened. Help us understand a little bit about that part of the aspect of what we're talking about.
Well, the short answer, I would say, is that it's a bad thing. Now, I know the people who've been on the positive side of colonialism, in the sense that perhaps they have wealth, a nice home, and they would like to think that this was all by dint of the sweat of their brow. Right. They don't necessarily want to think about the poor Native Americans or the poor Africans. But, the British, for example, they oftentimes talk about the railroads they built in India. They talk about the so-called rule of law. Although, even if you look at Hong Kong, for example, where I used to live, by the way, there was no vote. The Chinese people in Hong Kong did not vote for the English to come in 1841 to take over.
Right.
They just did it through the barrel of a gun. So to get to what I take to be the essence of your point, it was not only the English who we've been talking about, not only the Spanish who we've been talking about, and of course their two languages dominate the Americas to this very day. It's also the French. All you have to do is look at Quebec, for example, or look at Martinique, Guadeloupe, or even Haiti. For that example, the revolution there was a turning point in terms of the entire historical process. Or you look at the Danes. We all know about the Virgin Islands and how approximately 100 years ago, the United States, quote, bought, unquote, the Virgin Islands from Copenhagen. You had Swedish colonies and Swedish slave traders, like you had Swedish and Danish slave traders, for example.
Right.
So, and then of course you have these minorities, the Jewish minority, for example, were in on the ground floor in terms of settler colonialism. I already made the point about how their religiosity led them to be persecuted in the Iberian Peninsula, particularly by the Spanish and the Inquisition, for example. But the scrappy underdogs that were the Londoners tended to accept them. In fact, if you go to the end of my book, you'll find an anecdote about the 45th U.S. president when he's debating Supreme Court nominees. And he's wondering why it is that the United States, which at its root was started as sort of a Protestant project, why it is that the highest court in the land, every member is either Catholic or Jewish. Now, of course, the way that this is traditionally explained is because of the Enlightenment of the United States, the Enlightenment project, etc. I see it as really sort of the logical working out of this process of whiteness, whereas religion takes a back seat to, quote, race, unquote. And what's important about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of her ability to climb the class ladder, if you setting gender aside, is not so much her being Jewish, but her being defined as white. And the same thing for Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, for example. So there you have it.
Okay. Give us some more. I mean, look, this is fantastic just because we are laying down some of the complexities and all this stuff. And, you know, when we look at the colonies, and we just celebrated the 4th of July, as we look at the experiment that is America.
Hey, this is P.A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here. And if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
As we look at the experiment that is America, was it a different outcome possible in terms of like
definitely?
Okay, talk about that, because it you know, it seems like fait accompli. You know, like this was going to go, some kind of feudalistic guy would win or something. Okay, all right, this is what I'm hoping for. Give it to me. Make me uncomfortable.
Well, first of all, let's move beyond 1775 to 1783.
Okay,
with the 13 colonies. Now, keep in mind that there are dogs that didn't bark. I mean, for example, during that period, recall that Florida was under London's jurisdiction because of the so-called 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. Why didn't Florida join in with the other 13 colonies? I would argue that it's because the Spanish, because they had religion as a qualifier, was able to have Negro conquistadors. The Spanish had become heavily dependent upon Negro soldiers. In fact, when the United States takes over, circa 1820, takes over Florida, you have a steady stream of ships full of Negroes fleeing to Cuba, sort of the reverse of what we have today. And likewise, you might want to ask yourself, well, why didn't Quebec, which had just been taken over by London as a result of the 7 Years' War, full of French speakers to this very day, a direct result of the animosity between London and Paris, Quebec did not rebel. And historians sort of, as your question just suggested, they tend to see what happened as sort of a fait accompli, and then they just go back and analyze what happened. They don't ask these other questions. And then once you get back past 1783, well, there's the Louisiana Purchase. It was not inevitable that Thomas Jefferson would be able to pull that off in 1803. Part of it has to do, as you know, with the Haitian Revolution, which France was in the process of losing its most valuable profit-making colony, which then induces Napoleon to engage in this so-called Louisiana Purchase. Although, of course, as you know, the folks who mostly populated the territory, the Native Americans, did not necessarily accept the Louisiana Purchase. Or then look at Texas, for example. I just made references to Stephen F. Austin and how Mexico abolishes slavery in the 1820s under a president of indigenous and African descent, Vicente Guerrero. The slave owners in Texas are not necessarily embracing that decision, which leads to the so-called Texas Revolution of 1836, which is won, not least because of assistance from the comrades of Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin, et cetera, in New Orleans and throughout the United States. But then Texas is an independent state. And in fact, people seem to forget, but they need to start thinking about it. Texas had ambitions all of its own, that independent Texas, that were not necessarily in accord with the imperial ambitions in Washington. But alas, Texas could not stand up to the abolitionist pressure from London in particular. And so it crawls into the Union in 1845. But then, of course, it leaves the Union in 1861 to join the so-called Confederate States of America. And as historians generally agree, even though that war began on the Lincoln side to save the Union, more so than to free the slaves, and moved in to that latter perilous territory because the Lincoln government was not doing very well, quite frankly, in their confrontations with the Confederates. And so when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, it basically encourages all these black men, hundreds of thousands at the end, to join the Union Army, and that helps to turn the tide. But even then, you had folks in Texas, for example, including Sam Houston, who were not in favor of the secession because they had wider ambitions. They thought that the ambition should be to seize more territory heading southward, like into Mexico, and not stopping there necessarily. And as you know, we just marked June 19th, 1865, where we were told that the Negroes found out in Galveston that they were free. But actually, that obscures, as does a lot of U.S. history, a more complex and deeper issue, which is that the Confederates, Texas was like the safe space for the Confederates. Because, as you know, the Lincoln government had taken over New Orleans early on, had one in Vicksburg early on. So you had a lot of slave owners fleeing with their enslaved to Texas. And even some of the Native Americans in Oklahoma who had enslaved Africans were fleeing to Texas. This was a safe space for slave owners. Texas was probably less injured its physical plant by the Civil War than any other Confederate state. So the idea was by some of these Texans, well, the other part of the equation is that during the U.S. Civil War, as Washington was occupied, the French had moved into Mexico under Maximilian. I'm sure you know about Cinco de Mayo, the holiday celebrated by many Mexican Americans, which marks a battle between the French and the Mexicans. So some of these Texans had the bright idea, quote unquote, of rejoining Mexico under French rule and then having a kind of neo-slavery that would continue. And they were going to move all their, and then of course you had a massive, well, not massive, a significant migration of these slave owners into Mexico until Maximilian, the French leader, was overthrown by 1867. In fact, one of the leaders of this enterprise now is under fire. His statues are being toppled in Richmond. There's a building at the U.S. Naval Academy named after him. I'm speaking of Matthew Fontaine Maury, M-A-U-R-Y. Your audience should look him up. He's a very significant figure. He's called the father of oceanography. In an earlier book that I wrote about Brazil and the U.S. slave trade to Brazil, I talked about how Matthew Fontaine Maury in the early 1850s had this idea the United States should seize the Amazon basin from Brazil.
Yes.
Now, of course, people in the United States have forgotten about that. People in Brazil, trust me, have not.
Have not. Turns out they don't like that. Hey, a quick question on the end of slavery in the U.S. And we talk about Juneteenth. That's become a thing that's part of the zeitgeist now. But we also have the Emancipation Proclamation, which was like not failed, but not complete. And then we have, after Juneteenth, we also have the amendment passed that truly makes it again. Are any of those dates valid? As a historian, how do you see that? How do we reckon out, like, when did it end in terms of being legal in the states?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's a question, unfortunately, that's rarely posed. For example, in my research on Texas, even after Juneteenth,
Yeah.
I would say months after Juneteenth, you still had slavery in the United States. Now, I have not done, once again, these historians, bless their heart, they tend to accept these dates as holy writ. Oh, okay. 13th Amendment, end of slavery, end of story. So we can move on.
Shangri-La.
I mean, it's just like, as I oftentimes tell reporters, I've been made to understand that there are laws against marijuana in the United States.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that people still smoke marijuana, even though that there are laws against it.
Yeah.
And so likewise, with regard to slavery, just because you pass a law, I mean, doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to stop it, especially when it's so profitable. And so that's point number one. Straight up slavery continuing post 1865.
Right. Point
number two is just like the Texans who wanted to move to Mexico, they were going to try to have long-term leases. In other words, a 99-year lease. Now, since most people, even today, don't live to be 99.
Right. Yeah. Lifetime lease. Yeah.
That means that basically you work for free for 99 years. Fortunately, as I said, that was forestalled by the overthrow of Maximilian in 1867. Point number three, neo-slavery, the so-called convict lease system. I'm speaking to you from Houston. Not far distant is Sugar Land, where bones have been uncovered of Africans who, into the 20th century, you'd be arrested on a flimsy pretext and then leased out, for example, to a sugar plantation. That's why it's called Sugar Land in southeastern Texas.
Yeah.
And you work for next to nothing. You were like a neo-slave. And then, of course, we've had these stories. If you go to your search engine, you'll find that there have been Thai workers, Thai workers in Southern California who have been neo-slaves. They're locked into these garment factories and forced to work for next to nothing. In fact, you have the historian, I think his name is Kevin Bales, who argues that there are more slaves today, not necessarily in the United States, but worldwide, than there were in, say, 1860, for example. Yeah. And I think the reason is obvious, because getting people to work for free can be very profitable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I wanted to get into too about this time, kind of before we really have a real comprehension of what everything was going on is, you can't win a war. You can't dominate a people unless you have weapons and materiel. And that means someone's got to finance it. And that means, from my limited knowledge in this, it means you got to go to the Dutch and say, I need to borrow money. And so they're financing a lot of this domination, hate, murder, slavery, and everything as well. Is every country complicit in this? I mean, where there's ways to make money, financing, selling shovels and financing people who sell shovels, that's always a good way.
Well, you are correct to focus on the Dutch. As a matter of fact, if you look at the history of capitalism, and if you had been alive in 1610, you would have suspected that we would be here today speaking Dutch, not English. The Dutch were like the Spanish. The Spanish had a first mover's advantage because they sponsored Columbus.
Right.
Then the Dutch, who then convert to Martin Luther's Protestantism, 1517, then comes, like England, they too come into conflict with the Catholic Spanish. But what's interesting is that the English are arming the Dutch to fight the Spanish. In the book, there's a line that you'll find. I guess you could, if you want to find the line, go to Google Books and just search. Yeah. Where I say something like, the English were willing to fight the Spanish to the last Dutchman. In other words, so the English were sort of standing behind the Dutch as the Dutch were fighting the Spanish, and watched the two of them weaken each other. To the point, by 1664, as you well know, the English oust the Dutch from what we call Manhattan.
Right.
What was once New Amsterdam, now New York City. And as I say in my 17th century book, in a certain sense, London was fattening. It was like fattening a sheep for slaughter when they were funding the Dutch. They were basically fattening the Dutch, or in a sense, weakening the Dutch as they came into these constant confrontations. Because keep in mind that the Dutch had ousted the Portuguese from Brazil and Angola for a while up into the 1650s. And of course, that was due in no small measure to English support. But then finally, the English turned on their comrades, their Protestant comrades. There's no honor amongst thieves, as they say. And it was like a mob move. It was like Meyer Lansky spearheading the assassination of Bugsy Siegel, his homeboy.
Yeah.
It was one of those deals. But with regard to the essence of your question, well, certainly. I mean, we haven't talked that much about the French, to this point, and the French play a very curious role. On the one hand, as you probably know, there's this internal conflict in France between the Protestants and the Catholics, the French Huguenots, who, as you know, go on to play a major role because they're the losers to the Catholics in France. As a matter of fact, a turning point comes in 1572 with St. Bartholomew's Massacre. Either read about it in my book or read the whole book about it, because basically what happens is the Catholics, they invite the French Protestants to a meeting and then fall upon them and massacre thousands of them in one fell swoop. Supposedly, His Catholic Majesty in Madrid did a dance of happiness when he heard about this. And of course, the same thing happened. This is also part of the thesis in my book, how the Europeans sort of practice on each other, then they take it across the Atlantic, because the same thing would happen to Native Americans. They'd invite the Native Americans to a meeting, and then either at the beginning, middle, or end of the meeting, they fall upon them and massacre them all.
Yeah.
But also, the French Huguenots then go on to play, that's the Protestants, a major role in the building up of London. They play a major role in what is now the United States. Go to Charleston and walk through some of the cemeteries in Charleston, South Carolina. You'll see all these French names.
Yeah.
Because many of the French Huguenots wound up moving to the English settlements because, of course, they sought shelter.
That makes sense.
In London.
Yeah.
And then we're part of this whole settlement and colonial enterprise.
It's kind of like how you get Italians in Ireland. You end up, the ones that leave had to leave because the Huguenots weren't going to be able to stay in France and the money was elsewhere. And so they go abroad. The other thing I was going to ask you about, like when the Dutch are lending money, is it easier for them to extend credit to their Protestant brethren? Ultimately they lend money to us. And when somebody else comes in, and I'll just pick a bad person, an Islamic guy comes in from Turkey and he's like, I would like to borrow money to sail to America, to reap tobacco. Are they more likely to go, no, you're brown, no way? But is that how it works? Is the credit based upon, did they have fair lending laws back then at all?
Well, yes and no. I should point out that one of the advantages that the Protestants had, the Dutch and the English, was that they were, and I would also say the Ottoman Turks too.
Okay.
They were not as ferociously anti-Jewish as the Spanish Catholics. And therefore, the Protestants, and to a certain degree, the Ottoman Turks, because there was a large Jewish population in North Africa. And of course, many of them have wound up migrating to Israel.
Right.
But you still have remnants of that population in Morocco, for example. Or if you look at Camus. Everybody's been reading The Plague lately. His novel about another plague. And of course, he represents, and he talked about the Jewish population in Algeria, where his roots were. Yeah. So the diaspora networks that the Protestants and the Ottoman Turks were able to play upon gave them a real advantage over the religious sectarians that existed in Madrid. At one point, for example, when I'm talking about St. Augustine, Florida. Yeah. And so so when the English are moving into what they call Virginia in 1607, the Spanish know it, and they're complaining about it from St. Augustine, but they're tied down fighting the indigenous and the Africans in St. Augustine, and then they don't have enough manpower. So at one point, I said, what they should have been doing is say, imitate the English, move towards whiteness. Then you could drop on Poles and Germans and Russians and in the United States, Lebanese Catholics and Iranian Jews. I mean, come on, guys, get it together.
Yeah.
But they didn't listen to me, even though I wasn't around in 1607.
Right. This is just marvelous because I'm thinking about like the impact that religion, the well-being of a royal family, and their interests abroad, having the right kind of counsel from your people. I mean, if you get the wrong person giving you advice, you miss out. You're not catching up for 50 years, if ever. And so it's just interesting to see all of these players. And then, look, it's an archetype of humans. Someone's going to be more ice cold than someone else, and they're going to kill the number two person or the number one or whatever, and they're going to end up on top, and that's going to be the dominant landscape, and it does sort itself out. And it's always the people that suffer for these kind of things, all these machinations and schemes to get money and power. It's it's crazy.
I just finished a manuscript on boxing, and so boxing is
you are a machine, man. You write books nonstop. Wow.
So boxing is a sport where organized crime has played, shall we say, a pivotal and instrumental role. And so two of the scenes from this manuscript leaped into my mind as you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
One, you may be old enough to remember when the guy they called Big Paulie, I think it was Paul Castellanos, he was murdered in the streets of Manhattan in the mid-1980s. I mean, he was the top boss, but somebody wanted to take him out, so he was taken out. Right. Or when Albert Anastasia, I think he was getting a shave. In a barber shop.
Yes.
And the guys came in and took him out, as they say euphemistically in the United States. And so you can see the same thing in terms of these colonial powers.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, even though they're English Protestants and Dutch Protestants, they're supposed to be comrades, fellow co-religionists, etc. But at a certain point, England says, you know what? You got to go.
You got to go.
You got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Or as the baseball pitchers say after the third strike, I don't know if you have to go home, but you got to get on up out of here.
You got to get here. Yeah. Well, and what they more accurately say is people that don't want to die, leave. And if you want to stay, let's all have a meeting back over in this shed back here, and then what happens. Yeah. Before we run out of time, I want to pick a bone with you, and this is just me just kind of playing back with you. You talk about Pete Gray getting a job in pre-integration baseball.
Oh yeah.
To be fair, he was the MVP of the Southern Association the year prior to making the major leagues, and had excellent skills. It did not play out. And your point is an excellent one in that, hey, a one-armed guy's playing baseball. Couldn't there be a black guy? Absolutely. But he was an MVP. Like if you're going to be on the farm, you want to make the major leagues, being an MVP of your league with legit numbers is an important thing.
Well, my only my only response would be, if we're talking about the Southern Association, and so there were probably no black players in the Southern Association.
Oh, no, absolutely not. None. Not one. No Cubans, no Mexicans. Yeah. Probably no Jews.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think we really have to look very careful. It's just like, for example, when you have these debates, sociological debates, where some folks will say, well, the reason why more black people are being killed by the police is, of course, more black people having encounters with the police.
Yeah.
Because more black people were committing crimes. And so therefore it comes back to these Negroes acting up.
Right.
But then you need to sort of pick that apart and say, well, I mean, do they have a crime gene? Or is it the circumstances into which they're thrust?
Right.
Which, just like New York, I'm getting all these reports from New York and Washington right now as the economy plummets about the crime that's going on, but it's going across race lines.
Right.
And it's clear because, it's unemployment. People want to eat. People are getting homeless.
Yeah.
And so hopefully our present circumstance will lead us to a deeper understanding of these fundamental realities.
Yeah. Folks need to be able to eat. The evictions are starting. There's businesses that were thriving 4 months ago, like beachside property restaurants that are like, hey, we're not coming back ever, And to think about all these businesses that just bought money or food and supplies to restart, and they're like, nope, shutting down. This ain't good. This is, yeah, there's going to have to be some help from somewhere, and it's got to be from the government. It doesn't, I don't see it working any other way. It's a crazy time.
I used to take, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask you, when we look at these big social problems, slavery, etc., and we look at the colonies, and you know, because you're a historian, how just razor close of like the confederation of these colonies is, and each one of these ratifications. Do you think we could get any kind of amendment through Congress and then get 3/4 of the states to ratify? Is that even any amendment? Pick any one you want. Could we get any of them through these days? Are we just the same level of, I'll say the word asshole, now as we always have been? Are we any better at this kind of thing?
Well, with regard to a constitutional amendment, that's going to be difficult, which is probably a euphemism and an understatement.
Yeah.
Although maybe after the first Tuesday in November, things will change, but I tend to doubt it.
Yeah.
Secondly, you should follow what's happening with this idea of calling a constitutional convention, which the last time I looked, there were about 3 or 4 states needed to call a constitutional convention, which could turn this whole United States of America upside down if you were to have a constitutional convention. So you and your audience should keep a very careful and close eye on that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because a constitutional amendment is one thing, a constitutional convention is another.
That is yeah. And our Constitution is pretty old. All right. So when we look overall at the U.S., and we have this unique blend of 3 freedoms: political, the personal, the national freedom, are we going to be able to maintain this? I mean, one of the things we do is we argue a lot because we're always trying to balance really hard things to balance. Are we going to be able to maintain this, or do we end up having to reboot the entire thing, say in the next 25 years? Do you have any idea? I know you look towards history, but what's your sense of it when you look at history as a guide?
Well, first of all, go back and look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1944 speech. I think it was after his inauguration, after defeating Dewey, because he was talking about a missing freedom, which is socioeconomic rights, for example.
Okay.
We were just making reference to homelessness, hunger, etc. So Roosevelt was talking about that in 1944. The law scholar at Harvard Law School, Cass Sunstein, Sunstein, Cass, Cass, also the spouse of Samantha Power, former United Nations ambassador, wrote an entire book about FDR's 1944 speech. Yeah. However, I think it's fair to say that as of today, the possibility of FDR's dream in 1944 becoming reality is rather slim, to put it mildly. Right. However, once again, there's an election in November, and we'll see what happens. And we can talk again in December.
Yeah, well, I'll be in Texas later this month. Maybe we'll talk again sooner. But yeah, you're right. I don't hold out much hope. I mean, when no matter what we do, the person elected is going to be too old to probably do the job on a day-to-day basis, likely a felon, cannot keep their hands to themselves, and they reek of corruption. I just don't, and that's both of them. I mean, that's just across the board. Let me ask you this. When was the last president who didn't just at every opportunity enrich themselves? Who was the last? Is it Jimmy Carter? Is it someone before that? Because they all walk out hundreds of,
Well, most of them make their money after they leave office, usually by writing books. But even with writing books, there can be a little graft there too. Recall that Newt Gingrich, the former speaker, he wrote these books under a contract from Rupert Murdoch's publishing company. Rupert Murdoch, of course, controls Fox. Right. And somehow Rupert Murdoch, a very suave and sly businessman, overpaid Newt Gingrich in terms of these books that Newt Gingrich wrote for him. So you're asking a very difficult question because, as they used to say in the 19th century, you have to take into account honest graft.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, and people don't become 100 millionaires from writing a book or two books. You've written a lot of books. You're not sitting on hundreds of millions, I'm pretty sure. But
No, I'm afraid not.
I do appreciate it, and I love that you're out there doing it. Oh, I wanted to ask you one more quick question, too. When you look back at the time when Florida, why didn't they play a bigger role? Georgia had about, I don't know, a couple thousand people in it, but it became a state. Always shocks the hell out of me. But Florida had to have been, and I don't know the number, it had to have been bigger and more established, but also a lot more wild, maybe, because of all the terrain. What's your make of that?
Well, first of all, keep in mind, I talk about this in my book on 1776.
Okay.
Georgia was started as a settlement in 1733 with the initial principles of no Negroes allowed.
Okay.
But it didn't work out because by about 15 years later, Georgia's slave population was growing exponentially. But still, by 1775, it still, as you suggested, had a relatively small population.
Right.
And Georgia, the slave owners that were growing in Georgia were being pressed by Florida, particularly when it was under Spanish rule. And to a degree, even after London had taken over Florida, it was still being pressed. I would say that with the 1775 to 1783 war, one of London's major bases of support with regard to these conflicts was on the Georgia-Florida line. The Georgia-Florida line was the weak point, the Achilles heel of the victorious rebels.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, look, everybody, I can't thank you so much for coming out. Thank you for what you're doing, by the way, teaching our kids all this stuff, because it's just fascinating. Your latest book, and there are 40 of them. The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. And I'm going to start reading through it. I try to listen to these books, so hopefully you'll get them on Audible, because, I walk and I listen. But, man, I love it. I love that you're here. And, I always try to, get a lot of perspectives, because it turns out not one person is right. We need to understand these things from several points of view to get a sense for what humanity can be. And, man, I appreciate the hell out of you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.